Well, greetings from the ALEC 49th annual meeting here in Atlanta, Georgia. We've been having a great week of policy discussions, and I'm really happy to be joined by my friend Marlo Oaks, Utah State Treasurer,
Good to see you,
a great member of the State Financial Officers Foundation, and a good friend of ours at ALEC. And Utah, as many of you know, we've ranked number one in economic outlook for 15 years in a row in Rich States, Poor States, our annual report at ALEC. You can do that at richstatespoorstates.org. So Treasurer Oaks, you've been very involved in the financial space. You've analyzed as state treasurer, your state's resume and your policy, really benefits of so many good things that Utah does and has done for many years. How do you react to now 15 years in a row? And what's the success stories that you can share with other states? Or maybe you prefer not to so they don't overtake Utah. But what are the key lessons that other legislators can learn from Utah's experience?
Well, I think something that we really try to do well in the state is to control spending. Across the board with the governor, the legislature, right? People are really in kind of on the same page when it comes to spending. And that's, of course, key to controlling budgets and things of that nature. So that's very important. And then also tax policy, and having the right policies in place that encourage growth and encourage, the right kind of activity in the state. That's key. Mm-hmm. We're fortunate to have a diverse economy. It's very similar to the U.S. economy in terms of, different sectors and things. So that's obviously a benefit as well, particularly when it comes to a credit rating, which is something that I'm particularly clued into. But it's amazing the what can be done with controlling a budget. You can still have a very strong economy, right?
Absolutely.
And that's really important to keep government in a position to help business not get in the way of business.
Well, that's a great point. And spending, you can't have good tax policy for very long at the state level without having good spending policy, because as a balanced budget environment, it is what it is. You tax what you spend and you spend what you tax. And, it reminds me of one of our mutual friends, President Stuart Adams, Senate President in Utah and ALEC National Chairman last year. In his office in the state capitol, he keeps a plaque that says, I'll never forget this, when the going gets tough, the tough cut spending. And I think that's been the philosophy of Utah for these years that has kept Utah at number one. So that's a great point. So moving to the pension issue. So one of the things I always look at is, it's been discussed this week at the ALEC meeting, but with pension issues, it's basically unfunded pension liabilities. The ALEC report that just came out a few weeks ago show that the states now owe over $8 trillion in unfunded liabilities. A massive problem. That's even for DC standards, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the issue of pension reform, let's say Dan Lillienquist enacted over a decade ago in the legislature that really started to transition away from the defined benefit model totally to now more of a hybrid system. That's been huge for Utah, right? And talk also a little bit about how you've been working to educate on how to keep this radical interpretation of ESG and this movement that we've seen across the country out of state pension systems as well.
Yeah. So on the liability side, that has been one of the biggest challenges, I think, for states in general is managing those liabilities. And if you look at liabilities on an economic basis, which is what I think ALEC does, right, to get to that $8 trillion, that's the appropriate way to look at the liabilities, is what is the true cost.
That's right.
Right.
Because these are guaranteed payments in almost all state constitutions or contract law.
Exactly. So it's a massive financial overhang on states. And so, with Senator Lillienquist 10 years ago, I think that was a critical inflection point for our pension system, was to lower those future liabilities. And so that's been very helpful in keeping our pension strong and improving really the financial viability of the pension plan. And the biggest threat, I would say today, or one of the biggest threats to pension plans in general, is this politicization of capital.
Absolutely.
And so when you politicize capital, you can use capital to drive an agenda that is very counter to the fiduciary standards in this country with, ERISA law in the private sector. Really, the point of ERISA law was to protect the beneficiaries.
That's right.
And we see in the public sector with these pension plans, a lot of them have been political for a long time. but it's become even more political today. And you see, particularly this year, with returns in oil and gas being so significantly high relative to other parts of the market, what a major negative drag this ESG movement is on returns, and therefore a drag on the taxes and the requirements of states.
Absolutely.
To put in more money. It's kind of a double whammy.
It's a great point. And, our ALEC model legislation that we now have on the books basically takes that ERISA protection that you talked about for those employees in the private sector that are overseen by the Department of Labor and those laws, and applies the same protection to the public pension systems and their employees. And that's exactly right. Just treating public employees with the same kind of respect and protection that private sector employees has. I mean, we would think it'd be a no-brainer for people to enshrine this into state law, right?
Yes. And really the way to employ ESG and do it legally as a fiduciary is if everybody in the state accepted lower returns and were willing to live with lower returns and higher taxes.
Right.
That's basically what you have to have, right? But that's not the case. And so I believe it's one of the greatest breaks of fiduciary duty in the history of the country.
Yeah, why aren't people being put in prison for this? Right? I mean, they would be in the private sector.
Absolutely.
So the other issue I wanted to ask you about is you took a leading, really step, I think, to push back against what some of the bond rating agencies are now potentially looking at grading states and their bond ratings based on factors that really have nothing to do with the bottom line financial things that you think of when you think of a state bond rating. So talk a little bit about your effort recently with that letter and how broad of support you received.
Yeah, so I've been talking about for months how Utah has the highest credit in the world, and we do. We've never been rated below AAA, the highest level, by any credit rating agency. And so we have a very enviable track record in that regard. But that may not matter if we have an ESG rating. And it can be separate from the credit rating. We can still maintain a AAA credit rating. But if there's an ESG rating, then investors can point to that and say, well, Utah shouldn't be given the lowest rates in the marketplace. My argument isn't about the impact to our credit score. My argument is about the impact to our ability to borrow money in the capital markets because we have a rating that is separate from our credit rating. If they have information that is financially material that they want to report on in a credit rating, put it in the credit rating.
That's right.
It shouldn't be separate, because once you have a separate score, then you can politicize that score. So adverse publicity resulting in reputational risk is one of the social parts of what S&P Global identified as a future area that they could potentially score a state on, right? Utah, there's no other state that's had adverse publicity more than Utah that resulted in reputational risk. For heaven's sakes, a bunch of former polygamists started this state, right? and religious refugees, right? And so that is a very dangerous slope. When you start talking about reputational risk, and this is in a lot of ESG scores, even if they don't provide a score, that can be manipulated so easily, because suddenly now we are going to be subject to mainstream media's, story on the state of Utah.
That's right.
I mean, it is crazy. So we are seeing that this is the coercive capitalism. It's the ability to use money as a weapon against states. So you replace the legislative process with an outside entity that is determining whether you can get capital at the cheapest rates or not. It bypasses the Constitution. It undermines free market capitalism. It is the worst thing that this country has seen in a very long time. It can potentially lead to totalitarianism. It's very bad.
Well, and moreover, it also ignores all of the sound policy reforms that you've enacted over decades in Utah to keep you as the most competitive state in America and the fastest growing state in America over the last decade.
That's exactly right. And you'd think that the governance part of ESG, we would get a high score in that. We just remain neutral. Now, maybe it's because they decided not to rate us, but regardless, if you don't have Utah as a 1, the highest score,
Mm-hmm.
then who else is going to qualify as a 1, right? Because of our governance. But
well, as we wrap up, tell us a little bit more about your letter, because you had a really impressive, broad array of everything from moderate Republicans and their congressional delegation to conservative Republicans sign on, and all your statewide counterparts as well, right?
Yes. So I worked with the Attorney General's office, and we spoke to the governor, the lieutenant governor, the auditor, the Attorney General, the treasurer. We all signed the letter, and then the president of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and then both senators and our congressional delegation all signed on to this letter. I think it was an unprecedented letter.
It really was.
Basically pushing back on S&P, usually with the credit rating I determine, or the client determines a credit rating and who they're going to use. In this case, S&P volunteered to give us an ESG rating. We didn't ask for it. We didn't pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
So we pushed back and said, we do not want a credit rating or an ESG rating on the state of Utah, because we know it can be manipulated. And all of those, our entire delegation recognized the threat that ESG is. And we felt that it was very important to send a strong message and a united message. And I was very grateful for that.
Well, thank you for your continued leadership for good economic policy in the most competitive state in America, and look forward to working with you going forward.
Great.
Thanks for being here. And that's it today for ALEC TV, and a great conversation with Utah State Treasurer Marlo Oaks.